Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Nicole Mittmann. I'm the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards at CADTH. I'm moderating today's session from Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat populations. Wherever you are today, I encourage you to think about where you live and work and give thanks to the Indigenous people and present it from the Indigenous people, past and present, who have sustained and protected our land. So today, and happy World Evidence-Based Healthcare Day. Today is World Evidence-Based Healthcare Day. It is the third one. This is a global initiative to highlight the critical role of evidence in improving health outcomes, enhancing clinical care, and informing policy. CADTH is marking this day with this webinar, which brings together an international panel of real-world evidence leaders. For the next hour, we're going to cover global collaborations that are involved in order to optimize real-world evidence for decision-making. We'll discuss the importance of collaboration, and then, if there's any time remaining, we'll try and answer your questions. In some respects, this is a companion piece to an event that CADTH co-hosted this previous Sunday at the Canadian Association for Population Therapeutics Conference, which happened last weekend and focused on Canadian real-world evidence initiatives across the country. Today, you'll hear about collaborative work in Canada and that Canada is involved with many international partners. An international evidence ecosystem is really a global village, and it's filled with talented and committed individuals and experts and people who face common challenges at the intersection of evidence and public policy. And those who are willing to share their experiences and create a new roadmap so we can travel this journey together. So let me introduce the panel. We have a number of speakers, and so I'll do the introductions first, and then we will head over into the speaking. Meindert Boysen is the head of international affairs at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in England. In that role, he works with NICE international team and colleagues on science, policy, and research, and on international collaborations. Ashley Jaksa is the market access scientific strategy lead at Aetion. Her role focuses on forming partnerships with regulatory and HTA agencies to enhance their use of real-world data and support decision-making and set methodological guidance for RWE. We also have, Barry Liden, who is the Director of Public Policy for USC Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics, and helping measurably improve the value of health through evidence-based policy solutions and decisions, research excellence, and private and public sector engagement. He is also the managing advisor of Patient Voice Advisors. And finally, Anja Schiel is a special advisor, statistician methodologist at the Norwegian Medicines Agency, supporting both regulatory and health technology assessment projects, working as a special advisor, the statistician methodologist, both on regulatory, so European Medicines Agency, and health technology projects. She's been heavily involved in UNETA activities and with a focus on parallel regulatory HTA scientific advice. And our final panelist is our own Laurie Lambert, who is the lead of real world evidence at CADTH. Also a lovely pedigree, but we'll shorten this now so we can move forward into the discussion. So each of our panelists will give a short presentation. After all of the presentations, time permitting, we'll take your questions. Please then submit them at any time using the Q&A function in your Zoom function. Meindert, would you be able to get us started?
Thanks so much, Nicole, and hello everyone from England, where it's rainy in Manchester as usual, I should say. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm going to talk you a little bit through the NICE story around global collaboration to optimize the use of real-world evidence, and happy Evidence-Based World Health Day. First slide, please. Next slide. So NICE, I could say, we're the experts of evidence-based medicine and evidence-based practice. We look at value for money in the health and care system. What do? We balance the best care with the value for money, delivering both for individuals and society. And we drive innovation into the hands of health and care professionals to enable best practice. Now, our approach to real-world evidence is that we're leading the way, we think, amongst HTA and guideline agencies in the use of real-world evidence. But we want to go further, and we want to do that through collaboration with our colleagues across the world. NICE's vision for its products, and those are guidelines, health technology assessment of medicines, medical devices, diagnostics, and digital technologies, is to be continuously informed by data. And for that, we need readily accessible real-world data and real-world evidence. We need reproducible analytical pipelines, and we need the expertise to judge whether the resulting evidence using real-world evidence is fit for purpose. Next slide, please. If we think about where real-world evidence fits in our work, there's a number of use cases we've identified. They're here on the slide. I'm not intending to go through each one of them, but they're clearly the ones that we would normally see use in other constituents for real-world evidence. So think about patient or user experiences, characterization of the disease, the effects of technologies on the patient and the system outcomes as some of the use cases. And we've seen a large number of opportunities for real-world evidence already in our work to date. Next slide, please. Now, earlier this year, we published a NICE real-world evidence framework. This framework aims to advance the use of real-world evidence in our guidance by ensuring we use real-world evidence to reduce uncertainties and improve guidance. And it's also aimed at describing best practices for planning, conducting, and reporting real-world evidence studies. We think it will help improve transparency and quality, committee trust, and ensure we use real-world evidence where it helps to reduce uncertainty, improve our recommendations, and speed up the work we do. And there's a number of principles listed here on the slide of the real-world evidence framework that are critically important for its use. Next slide. Now, over the years, we've worked with many organizations in collaboration in the real-world evidence space. Here I divide them in three areas: the multinational collaborations, mostly through the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe. There's a number of them listed here on the slide. The scope of those varies. So, for example, Eden was on federated data networks, but we also look at methodology through Impact HTA, big data in cancer through Harmony, and we're now getting involved with real-world evidence for decisions. We've been one of the founding fathers or mothers, you could say, of GetReal, which is now, of course, the GetReal Institute, which is mostly focusing on promoting better understanding of real-world evidence. The second category of collaborations, I would say, is with industry, international industry in particular, and we've listed here three of the collaborations we've recently engaged in with Flatiron, with Aetion, and with Roche, and we can talk about the detail in the Q&A if that's helpful. And we've also worked with Duke Margolis on regulatory decision making and the use of real-world evidence in that space, specifically focusing on the FDA. So if we look to the future, we see great potential in further collaboration, and that's on the next slide, in a number of aspects of real-world evidence and real-world data use. So we're thinking about standardization and interoperability, methodological guidance. Although we have an evidence framework now, we think we can go further on the methods. We could harmonize tools across the real-world evidence space. We could extend our evidence frameworks, for example, in digital and medtech. We want to engage further with industry on demonstration projects. And we think about data and even appraisal sharing when real-world evidence is being used to make decisions, whether we can do that, for example, with our partners across the world and see how the impact of that data on guidance, whether that is something we could share. And we're starting to explore that if we go to the next slide through an exciting national and international collaborations. And here's one specifically drawing out our collaboration with CADTH, but also with the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care, Health Improvement Scotland, Wales, and England. And in that collaboration, which we recently announced, we're looking at a number of areas where we would want to collaborate. Actually, all of them have some component of real-world evidence in it. So if we're thinking about COVID, there's obviously a very clear scope for use of real-world evidence in considering COVID technologies, future-proofing of HTA, collaboration with regulators, and work sharing and efficiency gains, all the things I've mentioned before. So there's a lot of scope for collaboration around real-world evidence, even within the context of our very exciting new collaboration with CADTH, for example. And on the next slide, if you think about the specifics of collaboration, one area we're particularly interested in at the moment is joint scientific advice. I marked it here in the middle, and we're doing that with CADTH, but also with others. And real-world evidence and the use of real-world evidence to try and link the ever-increasing interest in the regulatory space in earlier recommendations and guidance. We think that real-world evidence will be a critical place for having conversations with our regulators. And on the right, you indeed see the innovative licensing and access pathway, which is a new initiative where the regulator in England works with others in the HTA world on joint scientific advice, but also on continuous risk-benefit assessment and real-world evidence. So the final slide, if I'm thinking about international collaboration and the potential it has the potential to share expertise and resources. We absolutely are interested in shared input on and prioritization of demonstration projects. We think collaboration in real-world evidence and real-world data could increase the efficiency of our agencies and product development, and it will overcome barriers to the use of international data. So our vision is to routinely use real-world evidence for decision-making, and we very much would embrace collaboration across the world with our partners. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Meindert. I'll hand it over to our next speaker, Ashley Jaksa.
Hello, and thanks for inviting me to talk about real-world evidence and collaboration today. We go to the next slide. These are just my disclosures. I am an employee of Aetion. On the next slide, the first thing I really wanted to talk about is ISPOR. So we know that there's a substantial amount of activity and collaborations going on how to optimize the use of real-world evidence and real-world data in decision-making. And a lot of this work is focused on learning by doing. And one group that has a decent amount of activity is ISPOR. So I am the operational lead of the ISPOR Real World Evidence SIG, so Special Interest Group. And I just wanted to explore some of the activities that we have going on that bring together a whole host of folks across the globe to discuss how real world evidence can be used and specifically how it can be used in HTA. So we're having a webinar here in November that focuses on real world evidence in HTA decision-making. And the webinar is going to focus on different HTA bodies providing thoughts on how they would evaluate and potentially incorporate a real RWE study in the COVID space into decision-making about COVID treatments. And really the goal of the webinar is to move away from the theoretical discussion on when and how to use RWE in HTA and really start to discuss a real life example of an RWE study that could potentially contribute to decision-making. So discussing the pros and cons of the study and how it can be used and viewed in terms of the totality of evidence to make a decision. There are a number of HTA bodies that are participating. So CADTH is participating. Amanda Allard from CADTH will be joining, as well as participants from NICE, the UK HTA body, and the HTA body in Ukraine. We go to the next slide. If we focus, I want to focus a bit more on opportunities for real world evidence in HTA and where some of these demonstration projects are and what they're teaching us about how to use real world evidence. So there's obviously a number of areas where RWE can provide additional evidence, both pre-launch and post-launch. If we slip to the next slide, that I really want to focus on the post-launch area and talk about what's going on with or the types of projects, demonstration projects, or these learning by doing projects that both NICE and ICER have participated in. So if we jump to the next slide, we'll dive into what NICE and Aetion actually collaborated on just recently. So NICE, as part of their process of designing and developing their real-world evidence framework, they were interested in comparative effectiveness studies, comparative effectiveness real-world evidence studies. And NICE identified atrial fibrillation as a topic area of interest. They updated their clinical guidelines for AFib in 2021. And despite DOACs, or direct oral anticoagulants, being on the market for a decent amount of years, there was never any head-to-head randomized controlled trials that compared the effectiveness of these drugs. So in NICE's decision-making, they had to rely on network meta-analyses, but there were a number of challenges with this data. For example, heterogeneity in the patient populations and in the trial inclusion and exclusion criteria that didn't really give a fair apples to apples comparison of the drugs head to head. So NICE was interested in AFib, and because of some additional RWE type focused projects like RCT duplicate, for example, we have really good confidence that claims and EHR data, so typical sources of real world data, could be used appropriately to study stroke outcomes in AFib patients, which increased the confidence of selecting AFib as a topic. So we went through and executed the analysis for this real world evidence comparative effectiveness study. And NICE really used this as a proof of concept for their comparative effectiveness guidelines or guidance that they issued within their RWE framework. Also, the demonstration project allowed NICE to pilot a number of different tools that have recently been developed to help researchers follow best practices in developing real world evidence. If we flip to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about ICER. So another HTA body-ish here in the United States. Their decisions don't necessarily, they're not binding to any payer, but ICER does issue guidance around and recommendations around therapies. So ICER was interested in looking at how they could use real-world evidence to address uncertainties 24 months after the launch of a particular product. And they selected hereditary angioedema, or HAE, as an assessment, and noted that in their 2018 assessment, if you tweaked or made minor adjustments to key cost effectiveness modeling inputs, that this could result in substantially different cost effectiveness results. So, one little tweak could throw the ICER, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, way above their threshold or way below their threshold. So there's some uncertainty in certain aspects and certain inputs. One of those was baseline attack rates for HAE patients. So in the 2018 report, ICER used the attack rates that were found in the randomized controlled trials, but it was unknown if this is really reflective of what happens in the real world. So in real world evidence, we were able to estimate the attack rates and other key model assumptions to update the cost effectiveness model. And really what this pilot or demonstration project really helped ICER do is gain a little bit more clarity on what topics are going to be relevant for RWE updates. And we actually published a paper on those insights just this year. We jump to the next slide. I can kind of go over some overall learnings from these types of demonstration projects. I think the main one, and one that isn't necessarily too surprising, is that RWE studies post-launch can really help address uncertainties in the evidence base. And so and from these projects, we know that timely and transparent real-world evidence studies are possible. And there are a number of tools that can help researchers make good study design choices and to create valid and transparent real-world evidence. But there are also still a number of challenges. So in the post-launch timeframe, who should really fund these RWE studies? How can we facilitate better data access? So data is relatively expensive, and sometimes it's hard to gain access to. So how can we better facilitate access? And then determining what evidence gaps are most appropriate to fill that will have the biggest impact on patients and payers. So these are just two examples of the demonstration projects. We've been in conversations and explorations with CADTH to see if there are some other types of projects that we can participate in or collaborate on to address some of these additional challenges. And I think that's it for me, Nicole.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley. Next up, we have Barry Linden.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I think Nicole introduced us as experts in real-world evidence. I'm going to say that I'm not necessarily an expert in real-world evidence, but we'll be talking a little bit about a type of evidence that might be used by HTAs in their decision-making process and could be related to real-world evidence in some respects. This is a slide that I used to be a member of the Medical Device Innovation Consortiums, where I got my first start at getting familiar with patient preferences. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are preferences and their potential application in a real-world evidence setting. First of all, this is a definition from the US FDA Centers for Devices Radiological Health, CDRH. A preference, and note that I'm just saying preferences. That's not necessarily patient preferences. In fact, we all have preferences, and there may be preferences that could be measured by not just of patients' perspectives or preferences, but also caregivers, payers, physicians, clinicians. There are ways to measure individual stakeholders' perspectives. And we're actually a part of a project at the Health Technology Assessment International, HTAI, where we're doing a project that is a collaboration between the Canadian Colorectal Cancer Society, I think is the name of the patient group, and the University of Calgary, who's doing a patient preference study on various attributes associated with colorectal cancer treatments. There's no specific treatment being evaluated. It's just, we're just asking questions generally about the attributes associated with that treatment. And we're working with CADTH, NICE, ICER, PBAC and MSAC in Australia, and ZEN in the Netherlands to get feedback from HTAs on the potential applicability of this kind of data. So really quick, what are preferences? They are the qualitative or quantitative statements of relative desirability or acceptability of attributes that differ among alternative interventions. So click next. Got a lot of animation here. So what's an intervention? It could be a health state, it could be a care process, it could be health policies. There's a lot of different ways of looking at interventions. You can kind of evaluate anything. Click. In one case, I'm going to give you an example. When I was at Edwards Life Sciences about 2 years ago, medical device company, we had invented a new treatment called Harpoon. I won't go into what it does, but it was treating severe mitral valve regurgitation. And we used patient preferences to identify what were different attributes of the various treatments options that we should be evaluating. So here's a list of those. So that's one way that you can identify through statements, through qualitative or quantitative research, what are the different attributes or characteristics or features of a therapy or technology. Click or next. Then you can evaluate using different kinds of methods, the relative desirability or acceptability of those treatments. But you can only do that if you have a comparison. That's hence the word preference. You actually have to compare what are the alternatives. And in this case, we were able to identify the order of preference from a patient perspective for this treatment, but it was only when they were making trade-offs between each of those different attributes. And then if you click next, you can actually also use patient preferences to identify quantitative values, put weights on each of these attributes. So you could see not just the relative order, but also the relative size of importance to patients, or at least in this case, it was patients, on the replacement or repair of a mitral valve. And we published this back in earlier this year. It's patient preferences are actually a quite complex scientific method that was developed based on a Nobel Prize winner, actually who currently works at the University of Southern California, where I'm from, who developed a technique to elicit preferences from a population for major decision making. In this case, it was around transportation. Okay, next slide. So are preferences real world evidence? Well, they are evidence. They're evidence of something. At the least, they are evidence of the perspectives or the priorities of the outcomes. So if you look at the outcomes as being, let's say, all-cause mortality at 12 months, or the ability to walk for 6 minutes a certain distance, these are all outcomes that we try to measure when we're trying to collect clinical evidence. But preferences themselves are not outcomes. You're not really trying to measure whether or not I want A versus B therapy as an outcome. You're just measuring what different outcomes do people put weights on. The real world part of this, I think, is that we are gathering information and data that's outside the traditional clinical trial context. And the definition of real world evidence that I've got here cited from the US FDA, which may not be the arbiter of that definition, is that it's clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits of risks. Not all real world evidence is really clinical, but patient preferences are not necessarily clinical, but they are evidence of a perspective on clinical outcomes. Click on the next slide, please. So I'll give you an example of how a patient preference could be used as real world evidence. Preference data can provide decision makers with information that can help us understand why a treatment may or may not perform well. The performance of the treatment in and of itself may result in an outcome. So preference data can help us better understand why are we having different kinds of outcomes, good or bad. Poor adherence to a medical treatment might be affecting outcomes, which the outcomes would be measured by real world data. And that may be because patients aren't willing to tolerate additional burdens without significant benefits. If you go to the next slide, so how can you use real world evidence? How can you use preferences to evaluate real world evidence? That's probably the sweet spot for patient preferences. Preferences could be used to help identify gaps in evidence, areas where we need to do more study because we've identified that there are attributes or characteristics of a therapy or an option that are more desirable than what we may have available to us in the clinical data. And that happens all the time. Clinical trials are designed, they're scientific experiments designed to measure very specifically certain kinds of safety and efficacy outcomes. But there may be other benefits that are really important to patients or people that are involved in this healthcare decision that are not a part of that clinical trial. So they can help us identify what other data need to be gathered to help us better evaluate this therapy or option. And you can actually weight and prioritize the different sources of real world evidence and actually make decisions about whether or not to even gather real world evidence based upon the priorities of patients. Next slide. So an example of how that might work is that patient preference data can be used to help provide decision makers with the relative ranking and strengths of various outcomes. For example, 12-month mortality, the need for a new pacemaker, the distance walked in 6 minutes, even mood, amount of sleep. These are all outcomes that can be gathered in a real-world evidence setting. The question is, how important are they to each other and how much weight should we give to them? That can provide decision makers with important information to help them determine whether or not there are different kinds of evidence that are worth gathering and whether or not that could be helpful for subsequent decision making. And lastly, it can help provide all of us certainty or whether or not the certainty or confidence in the data is as important to maximize. And I think this is a really key point. There's a lot of discussion that the value of real world evidence is not as, it doesn't have as much weight, or it's not, we can't have as much confidence in it because it's gathered outside of a traditional scientific experiment in a clinical trial. And there's some real concerns about that. There's opportunity for bias. There's all sorts of, it can be messy gathering a real world evidence. What patient preference data can do is help us understand, is that okay? Is it okay to have some messiness in this data? The patient perspective or even the clinician perspectives can help provide us with a better understanding as to what tolerance we might have with uncertainty in that data. So with that, thanks for letting me share my perspectives on patient preferences and the relationship to real world evidence.
Thank you very much, Barry. Our next speaker is Anya Shield.
Thanks, and I will try to make it quick so that we have time for discussion before we have to close, because I know we're on a tight schedule. So today I represent someone that not everybody might be so familiar with, which is the SciAMS initiative. Next slide, please. SciAMS stands for Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences, and it's a very old organization, as you can see. It was founded in 1949 by WHO and UNESCO. So it's in an official relationship with WHO and all the UNESCO partners. And since 2016, there have always been ICA observers of SciAMS in the ICA working groups. And there's a very different mission statement to all the other groups you just heard about, because this is an initiative that plans to advance public health through guidance on health research, including ethics, medical product development, and safety. So in contrast to others who are more like policymakers, SciAMS could probably be better be defined as a policy disseminator or knowledge provider for others. Next slide, please. And you can also see that there has always been, right from the start, a heavy focus on bioethics. One of the first and larger projects that the group started was around ethics. And there's also always a very strong focus on global, meaning that all these documents and guidances that are written on bioethics, but also on pharmacovigilance and product development, always are written by a very large and heterogeneous writer community, which tries to include everybody and have a very global perspective. Next slide. This is an overview of the currently ongoing projects, and you see that the working group 13 is a real world data and real world evidence and regular decision making, and we all hope that the number doesn't really have any bad luck coming with it. We started in 2020 in March. There are other activities ongoing, but one that is probably also interesting for many in the field of real world data and evidence is the last one, the artificial intelligence and pharmacovigilance, because this is obviously a first step up to what many people will expect to come in some not so far future, namely the artificial intelligence also in real world data and real world evidence mining, for example. Next slide. This is how all of this works. So our objective is to develop a consensus report. So not make policy, but agree on policy, come up with recommendations for the use of real world data and real world evidence and regulatory decision making related mostly to medicinal products. So we didn't go too much into the device story. It's very international with the involvement of almost all regulatory agencies whenever they have resources and participate. So everybody's asked, but not everybody always joins. And that includes the FDA, the EMA and PMDA, the industry, academia, and we also have various international national organizations, including the WHO participating. This is an extremely transparent process. All working group meeting minutes are usually made public. There are public consultations on some of the texts, not always all, with structured analysis and the use of these comments. So it's a product from a large group for the whole world, and everybody has a say in it. It always has an executive summary and a heavy focus on ethical considerations. And the publication will be a public good. So it is an open access online publication. And for those that require hard copies can always be requested free of charge and postal cost. So this is really very important so that there's a global dissemination possible. And on the last slide, I'll just give you an overview over the chapter structure. We have reached different states within different of these chapter groups, I must say. It is, as you can imagine, and you saw it on the Teams photo, this is just a small part of the group that is involved. Lots of people, lots of opinions, lots of perspectives. That's not an easy task, but nonetheless, we try to have, the general introduction to align our terminology, which is difficult enough, as everybody knows. We have a basic chapter on the real world for decision making during the product life cycle. So the how and when and what. We talk about the data sources, and we have a chapter 4 on the key scientific considerations, which is a very broad chapter on methodology, but also data quality. And the last one is the one that we always highlight. That's the ethical and legal issues in using real world data. And everybody knows the last bullet point, real world data privacy and data protection. But the first two or first three are actually far more interesting when we come to our internal discussions, I must say. The normative landscape, the ethical arguments for incorporating more real world evidence, and the potential ethical issues in the use of real world data are far more interesting topics than it might sound on first instance. These are really very, very interesting discussions. And I can only encourage everyone to potentially read this chapter and on occasion think a little bit more outside the normal scientific box, because ethics is a very interesting field when it comes to this. And I just want to highlight that this is one of the projects where there will be a public consultation phase. We hope it's going to happen next year in the first half, if the number 13 is not going to be very unlucky for us for whatever reason. And then we would really very much appreciate if anyone on this call, because there are no real world data and evidence experts, as we already have established. So anyone who has an opinion should actually provide their input, because this is exactly why this project has been initiated. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Anya. And our final speaker is Laurie Lambert. Over to you, Laurie. And maybe before we start, Laurie, just as a reminder, please enter your questions into the Q&A button. I'm watching a number of questions come in, and there are some comments there as well, but this is your opportunity to ask the speakers some questions. Over to you, Laurie.
All right, so I'm going to be quick. So next slide. And I really just wanted to focus on, the partnerships for purpose. The message here is just, there's a top trends. If we look at ISPOR, RWE is involved in a lot of these things, and what we talked about today, the patient voice. Next slide. Cross-country cooperation. So that comes to, why we're here today. And our work that we're doing is really focused on a lot of these things. Next slide. So this is something that Nicole presents often, but just wanted to highlight, I wanted to point out in red, is RWE is an issue being faced by all HTAs, and that's why collaboration is so important. Next slide. And we have learned, we're sort of 3/4 of a way through a 2-year learning period, and what we've learned is that real world evidence is about data, methods, and trust. It's about establishing roles and responsibility, and it's about coordination and collaboration. Next slide. So what are our partnerships that we have, and for what purpose? Next slide. So we have an RWE steering committee. That partnership is to facilitate and promote pan-Canadian organizational coordination and collaboration. It's chaired by CADTH and Health Canada, and we have a number of pan-Canadian healthcare organizations, including data holders, all different types of stakeholders, industry, and we're meeting 4 times a year. Next slide. We have partnerships to coordinate a multi-stakeholder approach that we're trying to instill. So besides our steering committee, we're talking to, I'm not going to go through them all, but we really are, we've identified there's many different types of stakeholders, and we're trying to work with all of them. Next slide. And one way we're doing that is we're doing learning by doing projects. So in our learning by doing projects, we're working, in partnership with registry, administrative data holders, decision makers, RWE experts, and international agencies. Next slide. We have partnerships for better access to real world data. So we're currently just finished a pilot project with a Canadian Institute for Health Information to improve our access to real world data. Next slide. We have partnerships for scientific advice that was already raised. So that, as well as with NICE, you can have an aligned process with Health Canada and with INES. So partnerships for scientific advice. Next slide. And now we have partnerships for CADTH's new post-market drug evaluation program. So you see we have partners across Canada. Next slide. So just showing we have core network partners across Canada. Next slide. We have network collaborators and we have specialty collaborators. So working with all sorts of different people, different types of researchers. Next slide. Partnerships for guidance. Next slide. So we are developing guidance for RWE. So we had a workshop on Sunday. So you can see we have panel members again from different organizations across Canada. Next slide. We have panel members from international organizations. Next slide. We have partnerships within Canada. We have data holders again, CADTH and Stats Canada. We have Health Canada, CADTH, INES. Next slide. And we have an internal partnerships that we're developing. So this is an example of an evidence bundle, we're calling it, where we really work together to look at health system readiness for a potential new disruptive therapy. So those partnerships internally are just as important as external. Next slide. That's it. So I was quick. So really just pointing out of how we're trying to really work together to move forward in this space. And we can go over to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie. And in fact, thank you to all the panelists and speakers. Excellent presentations today. For people who think that they're not experts in RWE, there's certainly a lot of work going on in this space. So it looks like we have some time for questions. And please submit your questions as a reminder through the Q&A button in the Zoom control bar, and we'll try to take as many as we can. I might start with an icebreaker question, and maybe I can ask our first speaker, who's had a little bit of time to breathe in between his presentation and now, about so Meindert, maybe if what we can ask is, what do you see as a key priority or the key priority areas for additional RWE guidance beyond evidence standards, and how could global collaboration help?
Thanks very much, Nicole, and fascinating presentations, I must say, from the other experts who are not experts, but brilliant. I think for NICE, the further development after our framework is really focusing on a number of areas. We're thinking in particular around the validation of real-world endpoints and the development and validation of digital endpoints. Those are two critical areas which we think we can provide further methodological guidance on. But there's also quality standards for real-world evidence and the use of machine learning and synthetic data as areas of specific methodological guidance where we think we can collaborate with others across the world and under the umbrella of ISPOR and collaborations that have already been mentioned by the other speakers. We think there's lots of scope to work together.
Thanks very much, Meindert. Perhaps I can ask a question that was prompted by Barry's presentation. How do the colleagues here on the screen feel about patient information as being part of the definition or included in the RWE definition? I know that this is a topic of conversation from a patient engagement, patient reported outcomes. Are you considering them part of your definition of real world evidence? And if so, why? And if not, also why? Maybe Ashley, as someone who works with databases, I can start with you.
Yeah, definitely. So would definitely consider patient preferences and patient reported outcomes and so forth, real world data. I think one of the challenges is that if you think about traditional, right now, traditional real world data sources, so claims data, EHR data, registry data, there may be a lack of that data being collected. So I think we have to, collaborate on making sure that that patient voice gets incorporated in specific types of data sets so that it can be analyzed and included in decision making. But I absolutely agree that it is real world data, real world evidence, and should be incorporated in decision making.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Maybe I could ask Anya, there's a question in the Q&A box. Where would RWE fit on the evidence hierarchy pyramid?
That's a difficult one because I always feel that the pyramid was meant for actually trial evidence, and only the network meta analysis were going a little bit outside the traditional scope of the trial evidence, but nonetheless they were talking about trials. For me, real world data and real world evidence is really this new tool that fills the evidence gap, and the evidence gap comes from that a trial cannot deliver. Doesn't mean that that we are now adding something that we could just as well have collected in the clinical trial, because then we would have collected it in the clinical trial. So it's the fact that we can't. So it's a different type of evidence, and I don't know where to put it in the pyramid, because it depends on so many factors: the quality, the relevance, and whether or not I could have actually collected it in a clinical trial in a better way. But that's always the point. I mean, sometimes you collect something in a clinical trial and you could have collected it in a better way in the real world, and vice versa. And this is exactly this, where we have to become real world evidence experts, where we have to make this distinction between when is it the better tool, when is it maybe even the more appropriate tool.
So not a simple answer.
Nope,
specifically on World Evidence-Based Healthcare Day, trying to think about where does it fit in the evidence pyramid, and it might depend on the type of method or study conducted, right? So it could be a cohort or case control. It really is dependent on the fit for purpose and the type. Barry, there's a question for you in the question box. Patient preference and personal satisfaction are somewhat important criteria in our HTA, yet there is scarce evidence to support them. Would local survey to patients and physicians be sufficient or strong enough to fill that gap?
It's a good question. I referenced my work with Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which did some seminal work in 2015 based upon the original work that was done back in the late 80s and 90s. And this is really science that's based on using a method of conjoint analysis. It's more of an economic and or price theory. And so a traditional survey, when you ask people, maybe through a Survey Monkey, what's important to you, it can be helpful, but it's not necessarily as reflective of what's really important to people unless they are in the process of making trade-offs, if they're making a decision between different things. So if I were to ask you right now, how important is it for you to survive another day? Probably pretty important for all of us right now. But depending upon where we are and what we're trading off in exchange for that survival, it might be very different answer for each of us depending upon our situation. So I think it's important to make sure that the methods that are used to collect that kind of information be capturing the best methods that we have available, particularly if we're making big societal decisions about access to a technology. You need to make sure that you don't have the potential for bias or other issues that can conflate the data.
Thanks very much, Barry. There's a question for you, Laurie. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunities you see for regulatory and HTA collaboration in the field of RWE?
Yeah, well, a good chance for me to mention for the SCIOMS document. I'm on chapter 2, 3, and 5. So I'm working with a lot of regulators and actually learned so much, and I feel like I've been able to make a contribution And certainly in Canada, you know, we have regular meetings now outside the RW steering committee. You know, we're developing relationships and trust with Health Canada. And I think that's going to have a big impact. Like it's hard, right? We're all busy. And so to try and work together with different organizations or even around this table, right? It takes time. And so you'd need to take that time and be committed to develop those relationships. And that's how I think that you move forward. So I think we are doing those things with Health Canada for sure. And I think people will start to see an impact of that in the near future.
Thanks very much, Laurie. And maybe even just thinking about, Meindert talked about the early scientific advice that happens often with the regulator as well. So there are different touch points along the way. So I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that we have some time for final thoughts. So thank you for answering some of those questions. We didn't get to all of them. There's a nice list of them. I was trying to sort of go through and make sure that we had some time to answer some of those questions. But before we go, I'd like to give each of our panelists a chance to leave us with a final thought. So perhaps we'll do this in reverse order than we presented. So Laurie, what is the most important takeaway message from today's session? What do you hope people keep thinking about in the days and weeks?
For me, honestly, like I'm just seeing a question here that for me to expand on RWE is an issue, is that we, you know, this is difficult work and we need to be careful. People are concerned about RWE. And so we need to listen to everyone and respond to those concerns and figure out how to do this. So I think collaboration is key. Partnerships are key, and people need to understand this is not, as Suzanne, our CEO, likes to say, RWE is messy, right? And so we're scientists and we're trying to find out a way forward to have trust and confidence that's with each other, different stakeholders, but also in the data. And how to do that is not an easy task.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Let's go to Anya. The same question, really, which is, what are your key takeaway messages from today's session?
Probably that we have to move away from real world data and real world evidence being such a shiny new tool and moving towards making it into a rock solid science, because we don't question science that much, but we question the approaches because we haven't yet reached the level where we are fully sure that we know and understand the use, the data, and everything that comes with it. Because in the end, we all have to make decisions, and anything we use has to reduce the uncertainty in our decision making. And at the moment, I think for many stakeholders, there is still this question: does it really do that, or is it actually increasing the uncertainty in my decision if I use real world data? And that can only be changed when we actually turn it into something that has a really scientific standing.
Thank you, Anya. Very wise words. Barry, thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are several comments or questions regarding the patient perspective and their voice being represented. And you know, I think including patients in discussions like this and including their perspectives in data collection decisions about what kind of data we're going to collect, how important that information is to the actual treatment of the person who is going through the treatment. I think we need to prioritize that. I recognize that we have a lot of different stakeholders who care a lot about how the resources of our society are being applied, and to the thought that, you know, our resources are perhaps in control of decision makers at the government level, to be dispersed to different subsets of our population based upon the different kinds of evidence are out there, kind of doesn't take into consideration that the people at the end of this are why we're doing this in the first place, and they don't have the time or the resources to participate in panels like this or involved in HTA decision making on a day-to-day basis. So we need to figure out ways to bring their voice into the room and make sure that they're represented, and that representation is representative of the population from a diversity and inclusion perspective.
Also very wise words. Thank you very much, Barry. Ashley, what do you think people will remember from today?
Hopefully people will remember that, you know, while RWE is messy right now, and we're on this road to having RWE become a solid science, there's a lot of work going on, and a lot of work is needed in order to better shore up the methods so that we are very confident in how we're collecting the data, who we're collecting data from, that it's a representative sample, and that and that we're analyzing it in a way so that it can provide us some level of insight. So I think that these demonstration projects, the activities that everybody on this call is involved in, will really help us lead RWE away from being too messy into this realm of it being a solid science backed by solid methods and best practices that everybody's aware of and are easily able to be followed when generating RWE.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Meindert, we arrived back to where we started. Any parting thoughts to wrap up this session?
Yeah, it seems to me that, but if we focus on the patient or the consumer of healthcare as the main focus for our future, with new technologies, with new evidence, real world evidence is the bridge between what we consider as classical regulatory evidence and HTA evidence. And I think if you think about learning healthcare systems, life cycle HTA, real world evidence must be the binding factor. And it's great that people are putting so much effort in making the methods, the guidance, the evaluation frameworks ready for a future around patients. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Meindert. And that brings us to the end of today's session. A big thank you to all of the panelists, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for whether it's your morning, your evening, or your middle of the day. As you can see, there's lots of exciting work going on into the space, and the international collaboration is key and will continue to be key. Thank you for everyone who participated and asked questions. We had more questions than we had time for, but I'm certain folks would be open to following up with them. Thank you for all of your time today. And in the end, it would be remiss in saying, wishing you a happy World Evidence Healthcare Day, and watch for a short survey at the end of this event, and keep an eye on the CADTH website for more information on other upcoming events. And with that, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.